chapter 10. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. We'll be there in just a moment. Continuing where we left off on Sunday morning. But first we want to go through our outline of the book as to where we are in the book. We're wrapping up. I should be wrapping up here this evening a section of a unit of chapters, but finding out where that is in our outline, and then reminding ourselves of these unit of chapters, what the content of the previous is and how they weave together as we come to the conclusion of that topic here in chapter 10 this evening. But first, the book of 1 Corinthians as a whole is about contentions among you. As we've said just about every time, if not every time, the church at Corinth is a church full of great many problems. In fact, when we outline it, the first outline is problems Paul learned by report. That spans 6 chapters of problems just reported to Paul. The problem of divisions dealt with in the first 4 chapters. I'm Paul, I'm Cephas, I'm Apollos, and I'm Christ. And then viewing the preachers as they would view the philosophers of the day. There's the issue of fornication in chapters 5 and chapter 6. In chapter 5, the fornicator not dealt with. In chapter 6, again bringing up the need to flee fornication. Chapter 5, there's a problem with the fact they hadn't practiced their discipline. In chapter 6, the problem of litigation. They were going to law against one another. Then in chapter 7 begins a transition from problems Paul learned by report to some questions they had. Now, these questions were spurred out a lot of it by the fact that there were some problems that were there that led to some of these questions. So we're still dealing with a lot of problems, but these were some questions they had, and so they asked Paul. They asked questions about marriage in chapter 7. Questions about eating meat sacrificed to idols in 8, 9, and 10. Questions about the covering and headship in chapter 11, about the use of the Lord's Supper in chapter 11, and then 12 through 14, as well as a unit of chapters on spiritual gifts. We're still in subpoint B this evening. The third section then is about false teaching on the resurrection in chapter 15, and then chapter 16 is the collection and salutations. We're in chapter 10. Before we get to chapter 10, let's quickly remind ourselves of chapters 8 and 9. The content of chapters 8 and 9, as again, this is a unit of chapters. There are 3 chapters dealing with one main issue. And so let's take and review these real quick. Chapter 8 was really the introduction or some warnings about the eating of meats sacrificed to idols. There were those in chapter 8 that had the attitude, according to verse 1, that all of us possess knowledge. And again, your translation may differ, but the English Standard Version, I think it captures it well, puts that phrase in quotation marks. This is not Paul saying all of us possess knowledge, but rather, this is him talking about their viewpoint. They were thinking, well, why can't we eat this meat? Because all of us possess knowledge. The knowledge being an idol is nothing. But the problem is, verse 7, not everyone did possess this knowledge. Again, verse 7, however, not all possess this knowledge, but some, through former association with idols, eat food is really offered to an idol. Not that they don't think an idol is nothing. They understand an idol is not a real God. But they grew up in idolatry. They grew up eating these meats in honor of these idols. And they know that sometimes those meats that were offered to idols, that were eaten in that honor in the temple of the idol, would then be sent to the meat market and sold. And they felt like if I go purchase this meat, and I eat it, and it's been offered to an idol, that I'm doing that in honor to or worship of that idol. And so, because of that former association, their decision was, I'm going to steer clear of eating these meats. He told them in verse 9 then not to let this liberty or right of theirs become a stumbling block. It's possible their liberty is put as a stumbling block the way their brethren. They're eating, verse 10. And by their eating, here's this other who sees it and becomes emboldened and eats. If they didn't eat from faith, they're weak in conscience. Now they've eaten that, but they feel guilty about it. Now to them it is sin. And now the one who aided and emboldened this weaker brother has now caused him to sin. And because of that, he sinned against his brother and against Christ. So the solution, verse 13, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never eat meat, unless I make my brother stumble. Chapter 9 was Paul's example. As those who said before, there were a lot of critics of Paul. And some of them probably looking at it were saying, well, listen, Paul, would you really do that? Would you really give up your liberties for the sake of your brethren? In chapter 9, Paul talks about him being an example of denying liberties. He denied himself the right to support. The right to eat and drink. Not that he went hungry, but he had the right to receive support to be able to go eat and drink for his work in the gospel. But instead he worked as a tent maker. He had the right to take along or lead about a believing wife, verse 5. And again, is the point that he had the right to have this wife? Well, that's true, he had the right to have a wife. I think the point is, as we pointed out when we studied chapter 9, I think the point is he had a right to take a wife along with him in his work, and if she's a believing wife, for them to be able to cover for her to go and drive with him in the work of the gospel. He had the right to lead her about. And then 6 through the end through verse 15 or 14 is about his support and how he has the right to support, and arguing that he had the right to support. He then comes in verse 15 and begins to talk about why he denied himself these liberties. He's of necessity to preach the gospel. He's not preaching it because he wants some financial gain from it. If Paul's goal was to preach for financial gain, Paul would have taken support. But he preached out of necessity. He talks about how he's become all things to all men so that he might save some. If he's with the Jews, he'll practice the Jewish customs. With the Gentiles, the Gentile customs. As long as they don't contradict God's laws. He becomes all things to all men, and by so doing, he might win some. He's not going to win everybody. But he might win some, because now they understand he respects us and our background and our culture, and they may be more willing to listen to him now. And he might save some. He then comes to the end of chapter 9 and points out that liberties are denied so as not to become disqualified. We're running a race. If you violate the rules of a race, you become disqualified. What Paul's saying is, in running the Christian race, if I do something that causes my brother to sin, or anything else that causes me to sin, then I become disqualified. So, if I need to give up my liberties so as not to become disqualified, then I need to have the discipline and self-control to give up my liberties. That's the point he makes in chapter 9. Chapter 10 now, take heed lest you fall. We covered the first 12 verses or first 13 verses on Sunday morning. He talked in the first 13 about the example of Israel. Here's Israel who was blessed. And as I pointed out on Sunday, we didn't go through that in any great detail, but he points out there about them eating the same spiritual food, drinking the same spiritual drink, and baptized in Moses, the cloud, and the sea. And I think he's trying to parallel their blessings to ours, and point out just as you were blessed, they were blessed. And yet, in spite of the fact they were blessed, verse 5, God was not pleased with most of them, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. He goes on to talk about several examples of things they did. Numbers 11, they desired evil. Exodus 32, they partook in idolatry. In Numbers 25, we're going verse 6 through 10 in order, so verse 8 now. In Numbers 25, they engaged in sexual immorality. In Numbers 21, they put Christ to the test and were destroyed by serpents. And then they grumbled, as some of them did, and were destroyed. Again, that's a whole lot of stories, but I think specifically probably Numbers 14. If you have a reference Bible, that's probably the reference it puts there. Where they grumbled and complained that they can't take the land and were destroyed in the wilderness because of it. And the point is that even though they were greatly blessed by God, He ultimately punished them because they weren't what they needed to be. Verse 11, now these things happened to them as an what? Example. Yeah, Romans chapter 15, when we were studying Romans 15 and then verse 4, the things written aforetime were written for our learning. And so this is an example to them. They were written down for our instruction on whom the end of the ages has come. Verse 12, therefore let anyone who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. Again, we talked about this on Sunday. The classic example of that, the first thing that comes to mind is probably Peter. But I want you to think about the people of Israel. Were there times the people of Israel became lifted up because of who they were and because of the blessings they received? Remember, even in Jesus' lifetime, where they're talking about, when he talks about them being enslaved, and he goes, listen, we are Abraham's seed. They're not being enslaved then. But, of course, at the time they were under the rule of the Roman Empire. But they put their stock in being Abraham's seed. And they thought being God's chosen people under the Old Covenant was enough, and then they turned away from him and they were punished. They didn't take heed. They thought they couldn't fall. They thought they were going to be just fine, and they weren't. They fell. But he gives us a reminder in verse 13 that no temptation is overtaking you that is not common to man. We talked about the American Standard Version in that passage, where instead of as is common to man, it talks about that it's not more than man can bear, which is brought up again later on in the text. And the point is, no matter the temptation, we can bear it and overcome it. You see, God is faithful. That's a reminder, by the way, that if God said it, we can trust it. If he said we're not going to be tempted beyond what we were able, guess what? We're not going to be tempted beyond what we're able. We can take him at his word. He will not allow you to be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation we find the way of escape. We talked about that word. It's a compound word in the Greek, ekbasis. Ek means to out of, from, by, or away. And basis means a stepping or a walking. The idea is he has provided a place to walk away. To walk out of that temptation, to get away from that. There's always a way to escape. We used this illustration on Sunday. Probably heard me use more than once. I think I used it a couple weeks ago too in a live stream. If this building was to catch fire, where are we going to look for? Look for the exit signs. You look for the signs that are red and glowing and say exit. And if the fire starts in the middle of the auditorium, you're going to find the exit closest to you. And sometimes in temptation, we think that we're in the middle of the fire and there's nothing we can do, and there's always an exit sign on the way out. All we've got to do is simply find it. There's always a way to escape. Now, these first 13 verses are not written to the weak brother. These first 13 verses are really dealing with who? The strong brother. You've got the weak brother over here who says, listen, I can't eat this meat. He's not lifted up with pride. The problem over here is the strong brother who, going back to chapter 8 and in verse 10, if anyone sees you who have knowledge eating in an idol's temple, it seems some of them think they can even go to the temple and eat. Probably going to the idol's temple and eat. He's an idol, after all, really nothing. Some of them seem to be lifted up with pride. That's what leads us into this latter half discussion, talking about eating meat sacrificed to idols. It begins in verse 14, and it goes through verse 1 of the next chapter. So when you pick up your outline for chapter 11, if you haven't got it already, Lord willing, we'll be in chapter 11 on Sunday. It begins in verse 2. Chapter breaks are normally really good. But they were not put in by the apostles, they were put in by men much later. And sometimes there's some unfortunate chapter breaks, and I think this is one of them. I think Lord willing, when we get to 2 Corinthians, we'll see another one of those in chapter 6 and chapter 7. So verse 1 of chapter 11 goes with the previous section, in the end of chapter 10. So verse 14 now through verse 1 of chapter 11, the eating of meat sacrificed to idols. We're coming back again. If you look at it, if you take verse 1 of chapter 9 through verse 13 of chapter 10 out of the immediate context, you're reading it and you're thinking, well, it's about the 9 liberties and it's about not being prideful. But all of this connects back to this issue that he comes back to from chapter 8 to verse 14 and this eating of meat. It's kind of like, if you will, Paul starts and then he puts a big parenthetical statement in the middle explaining some things about liberties and how to deny them and what the problem of not denying them is. And then it comes back to verse 14 and sort of picks up where he left off. Now let's come back to the real issue we're dealing with, which is this eating of meat sacrificed to idols. That's the problem we're dealing with. Here's what he points out to the verses 14 through 22. You cannot partake with the Lord and with idols. Let's read 14 through 22. Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak to sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I say. The cup of blessing that we bless is not participation in the blood of Christ. The bread that we break is not participation in the blood or in the body of Christ. Because there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we are all partakers of one bread. Consider the people of Israel, are not those who eat the sacrifice participants in the altar? What do I imply then? That food offered to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? No, I imply that what pagan sacrifice they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy, or are we stronger than He? So again, we're coming right back to the issue. There are those who are eating these meat sacrificed to idols, and I think some of them seem to have the attitude they get from this text. Some of them are saying, I can't eat it from the marketplace because I feel like it's wrong. And there are others who said, I'm willing to go to the temple and eat it because I don't see what's wrong with it. I don't understand what's wrong with it because after all, an idol is really and truly nothing. Is it true an idol is nothing? There's not really, it's just a carved image? Yeah, that's true. But the problem was, these feasts, these coming together to worship in the temple, they were done in honor of the idol. They were done in worship to the idol. Somebody may say, well, listen, I'm not worshiping the idol. I'm just eating food. What message are you sending when you're eating that? You're saying, I'm doing this in worship to that, or in honor of that. He points out that he speaks to the sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I say. The cup of blessing that we bless is not participation or communion in the blood of Christ. The bread we break is not participation or communion in the body of Christ. Talking about the Lord's Supper, right? We go to that passage to read in the case about the communion. Then he points out, is this not communion or participation when we partake of that in the body and blood of Christ? Is that not what it is when we eat that? Verse 17, because there's one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of one bread. You partake of one bread, you're all taking that, each taking of that one bread, then they're all part of, verse 17, one body. Right? They're partaking in the same thing. Consider the people of Israel are not those who eat the sacrifices participants in the altar. If you are one of the priests, or one of those who eat the sacrifice, when that's offered, are you participating in the sacrifice offered unto the Lord? And the answer is yes. So we say, what am I implying? The food offered to idols is anything? Or the idols anything? No, I imply that what pagan sacrifice they offer to demons, not to God. You say, I'm not saying that an idol is something, or there's something in reality changed about that food. In fact, we're going to come later on in just a moment and see if it's in the marketplace, buy it without question. But what he's saying is, when it's offered in that temple of the idol, it's offered in worship to, or in honor of, that idol. Right? And so let's go back to the illustrations. When we partake of the Lord's Supper, right, that's participation or communion in the body and the blood of Christ. Isn't that what he said? Yes. The ones that partook of those sacrifices on the altar of the Old Covenant, were they participating in that sacrifice? Yes. So if we go to the idol's temple and we eat the meat offered in honor to or in worship of that idol, what are we saying? We're doing this in worship of it. We are participating in that. That's the point he's making. He said, I do not want you to be participants with demons. In fact, he says, you cannot drink of the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Now, some of them would say, well, listen, we're not really believing the idols anything. Right? That's the basis back in chapter 8. That, remember verse 1, all of us possess knowledge. That's what their mindset was. And we know in reality what we're doing. And so we can eat that, but we know we're not really doing that in worship or in participation of that worship to the idol. Except He's just pointed out that's what happens when you partake of the Lord's Supper, participation in the body and blood. When those that would eat of the sacrifice of the covenant, that was participation in the altar, that sacrifice. So what makes it any different when you eat of this that's being offered, when you come to it at that offering? What's the difference? The answer is nothing. It's still participation. And you can't say over here, well, I'm going to participate in the Lord, and then I'm going to participate in demons over here. I'm going to come over here on Sunday, and I'm going to break the unleavened bread and drink the fruit of the vine. I'm going to be a participant in the body and blood of Christ. But then over here, I'm going to participate in eating this meat on Monday that's offered to the idol. What you're saying is I'm having participation in both, and he's saying that's not possible. You can't do that. Now, in this sense, he's using it in the literal sense of the eating of this, but there are other ways in which that can be tried to be done. In fact, I think a similar point's made in the other chapter I mentioned earlier, where there's an unfortunate break, that he's talking in chapter 6 and 7 of 2 Corinthians about how we can't be unequally yoked. We can't be torn and split over here and worshiping God and worshiping self, worshiping God and worshiping the world. We're either serving God or we're serving self. We can't be torn between the two. We can't be participants in both. That's what they were trying to do. Now again, they're going to say, well, listen, we're not doing that in participation or in honor of that idol, but when you partake of it there in that setting, that's exactly what you're doing.
There's some churches, certain times of years, they'll sell meals right there at church, fish and French fries and beans and stuff, and actually looks like pretty good food or whatever, but I just question or not whether a person should participate in that. I mean, they used to take orders where I worked, and somebody go pick them up or they'd deliver those meals. But in a way, it kind of violates your conscience because you think, well, we say that, a religious institution isn't supposed to be in the business of selling stuff. You know what I mean? And this kind of rings familiar with that, when you kind of question your own conscience, say, well, can I participate in this? Because, it looks like we're supporting. Well, I guess we are supporting.
Well, you're right. I think that you're exactly right. That's the message it sends. I think sometimes, even going back to this, using this specific example, and I think the context will apply broader than that, is some of them look at it and say, well, listen, I'm not approving of what they're doing. I'm not approving of them worshiping the idols. But the message I'm sending is, I approve. I've used this, mentioned this before when it comes to Romans chapter 1. Right? Those who do such things, that long list of sins, and those who give approval to. And sometimes we say, well, I don't agree with what they're doing, but we treat them like nothing's wrong. What we're doing is we are participating in that. Right? We're acting like nothing's wrong. And so sometimes, you're right, we look at it and say, well, I don't agree with that, but then we do something that's a participation in that, or a sharing in that, or accepting someone in something, and what we've done is we've just said, I approve. I'm saying, well, I don't. But that's the message we're sending. When we do that in participation of that, I think that's the problem here. They're saying, I think their attitude is, I know it's nothing, so I'm not doing it in honor of, but the message you're sending is, I'm doing it in honor of. And so that's why it's a platform. You can't partake with the Lord in idols. You can't partake with the Lord in demons. You can't be torn between the two. You can't be trying to do both. They're sort of trying to play both sides. You ever seen that? You may see that in maybe on a TV show. See it in politics sometimes. You try to build both sides. I'm going to build over here, and I'm going to build over here, and try to ride the fence in between the two. And you know what happens? Whether it's in politics or TV shows, you know what happens when that happens? In the end, you please
everyone.
Well, in the end, you please nobody, really, truly, because you're over here with this, but then you're over here with this, and you're torn between the two. And sometimes I think people want to do, well, I want to please self and world, but I want to please God, and you're never going to feel like you're as satisfied as you thought you should have been, but you're not pleasing to God because you're not what He demands you to be, and we're trying to play both sides, and that seems to be the attitude some of them have. We're sort of playing both sides of the fence, if you will. We're over here partaking with the Lord, but we're partaking with demons. Now, we know we're not really, we don't believe this to be true, but we're still partaking in this because we're eating of this because we want the meat, and then this is the wrong message. That's why verse 23, through the end of this chapter, is a regulation put on the eating of meats. So let's back up for just a second. I mentioned this the other day. What is inherently wrong with eating meats that have been offered in sacrifice to idols? I'm not talking about them in the setting we just talked about. But the meat itself, what is inherently wrong with eating that? Nothing. Right? Isn't that the point we've been making? If you feel like you can eat the meat, you go to the marketplace and buy it, then eat the meat. In fact, we're going to say that here again later on. The problem is not the eating of that meat. What's changed about that meat? Nothing. But it's the association with idols. So now we're shifting between when one should and should not eat. Now, obviously there are those who think they can eat. They just shouldn't eat, period. Right? But those who think they can, there are times they need to not eat that meat. Let's begin at verse 23. All things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any questions on the ground of conscience. For the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. If one of the unbelievers invites you to dinner and you are disposed to go, eat whatever is set before you without raising any question on the ground of conscience. But if someone says to you, this is an offering and sacrifice, then do not eat it, for the sake of the one who informs you and for the sake of conscience. I do not mean your conscience, but his, for why should my liberty be determined by someone else's conscience? If I partake for thankfulness, why am I denounced because of that for which I give thanks? So whether you eat or drink, whatever you do all for the glory of God. Give no offense to the Jews or the Greeks or the church of God, just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, that they may be saved. And so beginning at verse 23, again, depending on your translation, I don't think the New King James has quotation marks, but the ESV does. Quote, all things are lawful, end quote. Paul then replies, but not all things are helpful. Quote again, all things are lawful, in that quote again. Paul replies, but not all things build up. Should sound familiar. Where did we hear it before? Chapter 6. And it seems their attitude is, well, all things are lawful. Well, what's inherently wrong with that? With eating that meat? Again, absolutely nothing. But don't eat it in the temple. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. You don't just need to be looking out for yourself and saying, well, listen, I know it's nothing, but you need to be looking out for the good of your neighbor. Now, we need to be looking out for the good of our brother. I think that's Eleanor in chapter 8. Are not becoming a stumbling block. And that would fall in this as well. But not just the good of our brother, but the good of our neighbor. Who's our neighbor? Everyone. Could my eating of that meat hinder somebody else from ever responding in obedience to the gospel? Yes. Because what have we said? We just said the message that I am participating in what? Idol worship. So let's set the scene here. You've got an individual you're trying to reach out to talk to about their need to obey the gospel. Maybe they're listening, maybe they're not. But they're still going to the temple to worship idols. And they go to the temple to worship idols, and as they're there at that feast in honor of that idol, who do they see sitting on the other side of the room? But the person trying to convert them. What message have you sent? Again, I'm participating in this. Well, if you become a Christian and you worship an idol, then if you don't become a Christian, you worship an idol, then what's the need in becoming a Christian, right? You're coming right back to the same place this other person is. That might prevent somebody from obeying the gospel. They may look at it as, they feel like what I'm doing is okay. Now they tell me, well, listen, idols aren't real and we don't need to worship idols. And there's one true God. And then I see them at the eating of that sacrifice. I feel like they're telling me, like that one trying to teach me is telling me, you know what? I'm here to worship the idol too. That gives me everyone's ability. It's not just his own good. That would be the filling of his belly, I think, in this specific here, right? He wants to go eat the meat. He needs to be looking out for his neighbor. Verse 25, eat whatever is sold in the meat market. If you go to the meat market and there's meat being sold, you can buy it and eat it. Verse 25, without raising any question on the ground of conscience. Verse 26, or verse 27, if an unbeliever invites you to dinner and you're supposed to go eat whatever is set before you without raising any question on the ground of conscience. So, again, you go to the meat market. and you buy whatever meat it is you want to eat. You buy it from the meat market, and you go home, you cook it, you eat it. Let's say that's been sacrificed to an idol. And let's just suppose it's been sacrificed. Some was and some wasn't. Let's suppose it was. Let's go back to our question before. What's inherently wrong with eating that meat? Nothing. Then why not raise any question? Well, he said for the sake of doctrine. I'm going to come back and explain that more in a moment. We go to this person's house to eat. There's somebody that's an unbeliever. And they've invited, maybe I work with them, whatever it is. Maybe it's that person I'm trying to talk to, and they invite me over for dinner. And they set before me some kind of meat. That meat set before me, as long as I'm the stronger brother, right? If it feels like meat now, what should I do? I should eat the meat without raising any questions. Why do I not raise questions? Same reason as before, for conscience sake. But he would point out later on in verse 28 where he said, if you've been told it's offered as a sacrifice to idol, then you shouldn't eat it. So let's go back to our scenario here. We go to this individual's house to eat. Right? They bring us over to eat. They invite us over. They put this meat before me. It's been sacrificed to an idol. They tell me nothing. What's wrong with that? Absolutely nothing. They invite me over for dinner. They put this meat before me. Same meat as they did in the first scenario. But this time they say that's been offered to an idol. Now what should I do? I should not eat it. What's changed about the meat? You knew. But about the meat itself, what's different from before and after? Nothing. Except the fact that you know. Would it be wrong to eat that meat? Well, it wasn't wrong before. Except it's for the sake of conscience. For the conscience too. Listen to what it says. For the sake of the one who informed you, and for the sake of conscience, I don't mean your conscience, but his. Let's go back to our earlier scenario. Could going to the temple and eating that meat hinder somebody from obeying the gospel? Absolutely. What about now that this meat's no longer in that temple and it's been sacrificed and it's put before me and I'm told?
Same scenario.
Same scenario. I'm sending the picture that I am okay with it. So I don't eat it. And then I explain, here, I'm not going to eat that. And explain that to them. He says, for why should my liberty be determined by someone else's conscience? Why should my liberty, do I have a right to eat that meat? Well, yes. Why should my liberty be determined by somebody else's conscience? Verse 29. If I partake with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of that for which I give thanks? If I give thanks for it, what's changed? If I know what I don't know.
We're responsible for our neighbor's conscience.
Responsible for the neighbor's conscience and the impact we have on that one. Again, if we eat that meat and we know, and then we eat it, and they know, and they saw us eat it, then we send a message to them. They think that we're okay with that. Let's go back to the earlier scenario. That one I think is a little bit clearer. Right? If they put it before you and they say we don't eat it. Let's go back to verse 25. Eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising question on the ground of conscience. Whose conscience, again, I think the point made down in verse 29 is the conscience of your neighbor, not yours. Well, why does it make a difference if I buy it in the meat market and then go eat it in my own home and I know that it's offered? What if somebody asks me about that? Right? Let's go back to the second scenario again. That meat was put before me when I went to somebody's house and they didn't tell me. And then maybe they said afterwards that was sacrificed to an idol, and we say, well, if I'd have known that, I wouldn't have eaten it. And we explain, and now they understand. Okay, I get what you're saying. What if somebody knew that it had been offered as a sacrifice, and I take it home, and then they did you enjoy your steak or whatever it was you bought in the meat market? Yes. Do you know it's been sacrificed to an idol? Yes, I did. Now, what message am I sending in to them? That I'm accepting that idol worship. And so the point is, you're doing it for the sake of the other. You're not becoming a hindrance. Verse 31, so whether you eat or drink, whatever you do, do all the glory of God. Give no offense to the Jews or Greeks or to the church of God. Don't do something that could become an offense to the Jews or to the Greeks. Wait a minute, why the Jews or to the Greeks? Back up to chapter 9, Paul says, I have become what? All things to all men. Why? That I might save some, right? If I was with the Jews, I would practice the Jewish customs as long as it violates God's law. If I'm with the Gentiles, I'll practice the Gentiles' customs as long as it doesn't violate God's law. And by doing so, you send a message that you respect them and their culture, and they may be more willing to listen. Well, now you do nothing to give offense to Jews or Greek. Verse 33, so just as I try to please everyone and everything, tying it back to the previous chapter, he's bringing it back to what we just did. And everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, that they may be saved. Again, ultimately, it's coming back to this point that Paul makes. His goal is to save others. Right? A lot of Paul's work that he did, we saw this in Romans, when we were studying Romans, he talked about it, was he wasn't going to churches established. He did go to churches established and talk to them. But most of Paul's work was done going into areas where the gospel had been preached and helping convert people and establish churches. Right? And that's where a lot of Paul's work was. His goal was to save people, right? Take them the message they needed to hear. And anything, any liberty, any right he had that might become a hindrance to somebody obeying, he's saying, I'm willing to give that up. So let's come back and tie this in again. Paul was willing to give up liberties so it didn't affect him with his brother in chapter 9. Right? He would deny himself to support so that it didn't give others an occasion to look at him and have a wrong view of him. He's willing to deny himself of that and then he's willing to become all things to all men and deny himself of liberties so that he might save some. He might prefer to keep the Jewish customs or the Gentile customs or neither. But he's going to do what he needs to do, or give up what he needs to give up, as long as truth isn't at stake, so he might save some. So, chapter 9, chapters 8 and chapter 10, if eating meat causes my brother to stumble, I should abstain, give up that liberty. If eating meat causes a hindrance with my neighbor to violate their conscience, I should abstain. So even if every brother over here is agreeing with me that it's okay to eat this meat, when I know it's been offered to an idol, I might become a hindrance to my neighbor. It might be to my brother, but it could also be to those outside. That's where verse 1 of chapter 11 ties in. Be imitators of me as I am of Christ. Paul just said at the end of the chapter, here's what I do to not become a hindrance to the gospel and to save some. And so, what's the solution? Imitate the example I set for you. That same example he talked about in chapter 9. Right, his example of denying liberties. If we need to deny liberties to save our brother or to help save others, we should be willing to do so and be an imitator of Paul within the confines that he's being an imitator of Christ. Right? And so that's the restriction put on that. You imitate him, but only because he's an imitator of Christ. But the point is, just as Paul's willing to deny himself liberties for the furtherance of the gospel and help his brethren, we should, the church at Corinth should have been, we today should, be willing to deny ourselves liberties for the furtherance of the gospel and help our brethren who may be weaker in conscience. Now, we've got like 15 seconds remaining, so we don't have time to get into the next chapter this evening, but if you haven't already, pick up an outline on chapter 11. We may only get through about half of it. There are two different issues in chapter 11, as opposed to we've had 3 chapters dealing with one issue. We've got 1 chapter dealing with 2 different ones. We'll talk about history for the covering in 2 through 16. We'll build it on Sunday morning. We may get to the Lord's Supper, depending on time. But I pick that up. We'll be picking up again. We're building, at least dealing with that first one on the covering and headship in 2 through 16 on Sunday morning.